Okay, welcome everybody to this week's mental health webinar. My name is Danny, and I will be the presenter tonight. So let me get some things arranged real quick in terms of Zoom. Oopsies. Because I'm on a weird system and I'm not quite sure what I'm doing yet. So there we go. Let's see if I can do that. All right, we're gonna go with it. All right, so tonight's topic is intimate partner violence. And I want to, before we kind of delve into the meat of this topic, kind of highlight a couple of things. One, when you're in a couple relationship, it's pretty common to have disagreements and arguments. I actually take the personal standpoint of it's actually healthy to be able to argue and disagree with your partner. Now, there's a lot of factors that go into that in terms of what makes it a good process rather a damaging process. But I'm a big believer in that when we have conflict in our intimate relationships or with our spouse, it can be a connecting thing. It does not always have to be this like polarizing thing where we are struggling to connect and then it escalates and then we are at each other's throats. So I want to differentiate that intimate partner violence is not disagreeing or arguing with your partner or your spouse. It is not getting into heated discussions. It's not just having conflict with your spouse. It's something much greater. And having a good dose of that conflict, of disagreement, of argument can be healthy, but that's not the level that we're talking about here. We are talking about something a little bit much more severe. And so I wanted to kind of put that out there as we go forward in this presentation tonight. So what is intimate partner violence? I abbreviate intimate partner violence as IPV just for ease's sake. And what intimate partner violence is it's any physical, verbal, emotional, psychological, or even sexual abuse from one partner to another. Now, when we talk about abuse, there typically is a level of power or an aspect of power that comes in with those acts. So the power kind of manifests itself in force or coercion. So when one partner has more power over the other and they use these force tactics or coercive tactics to, get their point across or to engage in physical violence, that's the distinguishing factor is the level of power in these acts. So intimate partner violence automatically includes this level or like this aspect of who has power and who has less power in the relationship. Because typically when there is abuse present, the person that has more power typically is the one perpetrating the abuse or the violence. It's important to recognize that force and coercion are a big part of intimate partner violence. We'll get into a little bit more detail about different types of violence and maybe what it looks like. This is actually a lot more common than we realize, but knowing that it does happen, that force and coercion are typically a part of violence, and that one or both partners get hurt, not just emotionally, but physically, psychologically hurt in this process. That is what intimate partner violence. It's any act of physical, psychological, emotional, or sexual abuse with force and coercion, which abuse automatically kind of encapsulates force and coercion. It's actually, intimate partner violence is actually a lot more prevalent than we realize. And I think it's important to recognize that because a lot of times when we are in a violent relationship or we're experiencing intimate partner violence, it feels very isolating. And I would say I think that is very true for being in our church as well. We kind of tend to take on this mindset of like, okay, is this just me? Like, how do I talk about this? Do I talk about this? Like, I don't know how to approach this. This is such a taboo topic. And, you know, talking about it can lead to a bunch of different outcomes, both negative and positive. But it's good to know that if you are experiencing this, you are not alone. About 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 10 men have experienced some form of intimate partner violence in their life. So that's a pretty big, you know, that's a good chunk, you know, a quarter of women, and, you know, a good portion of men have these violent experiences in their romantic relationships. So it's important to recognize that of those 25% of women, about 35% of them actually received some type of severe physical injury where they had to get medical treatment. So that, you know, that the injuries can be, you know, broken bones, bruises, cuts. It could even be as bad as like a traumatic brain injury. But that doesn't always happen. Women are a more vulnerable population to IPV, just because of physical stature. Men typically have more physical prowess and can do more physical damage than women. However, a majority of intimate partner violence is perpetrated by both men and women. And it's really important to recognize this because when it comes to violence in our relationships, typically it's a circular pattern. And we get into this dance with our partner where we start to engage in patterns where we kind of push our partner, they push back, we keep pushing, they keep pushing, and it just escalates until violence is present. Now, that in no way, shape, or form excuses the fact that violence is present. Part of what I'm hoping to get at tonight is finding ways to help stop that from happening if that's what's going on for you or for somebody that you know, is to kind of help stop that process. Because a majority, like I said, a majority of intimate partner violence is perpetrated by both men and women. It is not solely perpetrated by men. And that's important to recognize. The severity of intimate partner violence can range, so from mild to severe, from a shove and a push or being restrained to all the way to having weapons pulled on you and threaten to harm you with weapons. So there's quite a spectrum here of what intimate partner violence can look like. I would say the more severe types of intimate partner violence are a bit more rare. And most of the intimate partner violence kind of sits in this range, this mild to moderate range, where we're shoving, we're hitting, we're restraining, we're, you know, maybe kicking and hitting. I think I said hitting, but, you know, so there's just kind of this range here where it can do damage, but we're not pulling knives on our partners, we're not pulling guns on our partners. Those are very, very severe instances, and they do happen, but they don't always happen, and it doesn't have to happen for it to be considered intimate partner violence. So considering that, when we have severe intimate partner violence, or even the research shows that the severity is typically cumulative, meaning if you have one type of severe intimate partner violence, you probably have the others. In my work with intimate partner violence survivors, the ones that have very severe experiences and very traumatic experiences, very rarely just experienced physical abuse. They experienced psychological abuse, they experienced sexual abuse, they experienced emotional abuse. So they kind of had the whole package together, which compounds the severity. So not only were they being hurt physically, they also had these other components that were abusive in the relationship happening to them, making the severity of the violence they were experiencing even greater, and leading to, you know, worse and more severe outcomes. The other thing to know is, like, The severity is a perception piece, and this goes for all trauma, honestly. When there is a survivor of a trauma, how they perceive it in terms of how severe it was or how much it impacted them is an important factor in the outcomes they experience. So for IPV, considering the person's fear, the survivor's fear, that's a really good indicator of how severe the violence actually is. If they have high levels of fear, particularly of their partner, which then leads to other people if they're in that violent relationship long enough, we can see patterns in how they interact with other people. That fear is a good indicator that this relationship has been really hard and very violent or very traumatic for them. So considering the fear that people have, or that you see maybe your friends or yourself that you have in your relationship, is a good indicator that, hey, if there's some fear here, maybe we need to look at this. A lot of times too, when the violence is not as severe, when it's kind of in this mild to moderate range, sometimes we have a hard time recognizing what is actually happening. We have a hard time recognizing, like, oh, my partner and I are violent to each other. And it seems like it would be so obvious, but a lot of times it goes over people's heads. I've had clients where, they think that when something happens in the context of their marriage, it's okay, even if they were not willing in that moment. And it took somebody saying, like, that was forceful or coercive, that was abuse, for them to sit there and be like, oh, like that relationship was violent, that relationship was abusive, that was not okay, even though we were married. And so considering that, just because in a marriage, we kind of think like, no, this doesn't happen, but being aware that it does, and if it does, there are things we can do to stop it, but we got to kind of also figure out what's actually happening and recognizing that, oh, this is happening in my relationship. The other thing I want to say is, just because IPV is happening does not mean that the marriage is automatically over or destroyed or ruined. There's so much nuance in IPV. And there are times when, yes, like, we need to consider the stability of this relationship and if it's good to continue in it. But there are a lot of times too where it's like, oh, we just have some bad patterns that we need to figure out. And we'll talk about like the nuances and what this looks like on a deeper level in just a minute. I don't think I need to go into that part. Just know that it's good to know that for those that have exposure to intimate partner violence as a child, like if their parents were violent, if you have childhood trauma, if you struggle with mental health in general, those things can impact violence in your relationship, whether you're a victim or you are a perpetrator. So it's not a like end all be all, like I have these things, I am going to experience violence in my relationship. It doesn't work that way. But the research shows like those things do impact how we handle relationships and how we engage with close people to us. The other thing to know is that if you are experiencing violence, one of the biggest factors that helps people either stop violence or figure out how to manage the relationship or decide whether they need to stay or leave is social support. So violence is very isolating, not just emotionally and mentally, but socially. When we get in these violent relationships, we typically tend to keep ourselves from other social relationships. One, for fear that somebody's going to figure it out. Two, shame that we're in this position. And that shame can be based in a lot of things. It could be based in the messages we're receiving from our partner who's being violent towards us. It could be shame based in the fact that it's happening at all. It could be shame based in beliefs about ourselves that we're gathering about what's happening. So it's, there's the shame aspect, and shame encourages us to hide and not connect. And then there is a type of violence where we are isolated because of the violence. Like part of the violence is isolation. And so when we are in these situations, we have to really be cognizant of how isolated we are. The literature is very clear that those that have a good social support system, whether it's family or friends or a church group or a school group or other type of social group, those people are much more likely to healthily deal with this issue and figure out what they need to do to stop the violence. They're much more prepared. They're much more able to figure out this situation and navigate something that's very tricky and very difficult. The literature is also clear that most partners, even though there's violence in the relationship, most partners want to stay together, which is pretty cool, because to me that says, like, okay, even though there's violence happening, it's not for lack of care or desire for the relationship. Most often, again, most IPV perpetrated by men and women, and most often it's not about that, like not dissatisfaction. It's not about trying to break the relationship. It's about like care and concern, and we really have a hard time with conflict. So considering that, IPV has a lot of impacts, mostly mental health. Survivors of IPV typically struggle with depression, anxiety, and PTSD, which is not surprising. IPV is a trauma, so the same outcomes you would have for any type of trauma would also apply for intimate partner violence. I will say, like, the variety of impact of IPV is a little bit different. So depending on the type of intimate partner violence you experience. So if you're experiencing more psychological or emotional abuse, anxiety and depression are a lot more prevalent. Whereas if you're experiencing physical or sexual abuse, PTSD is a little bit more prevalent. And that's not to say anxiety and depression don't exist for all of them, or that PTSD doesn't exist for all of them. But the anxiety and depression are much higher for those that experience psychological and emotional abuse. And then PTSD is much more high for sexual and physical abuse. Another outcome, it's pretty difficult, especially if you're on this more severe side of experiencing intimate partner violence. It's much more difficult to form and keep relationships, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, you have the trauma and the brain theory. So, when we have trauma, our brain kind of switches in how it functions, and it doesn't always stay that way. The changes or the switches it makes in those moments is for survival, and that's where we get our flight, fight, freeze responses. Those responses are God-given in my mind to help us survive. If we didn't have them, I think we would be a lot worse off when we experience trauma. So we have those responses, but sometimes when the trauma is severe enough, our brain stays in that process of only choosing fight, flight, or freeze. And that's when we develop PTSD. That's when we develop that we may dissociate. Dissociation is where we kind of have an out-of-body experience where, like, our mind kind of separates from the moment, and we're kind of not here, even though we are here. That's kind of a really rough way of describing dissociation, but we'll go with it for now. So good God-given responses, but when we get stuck in those responses, that's when we have a hard time actually interacting and engaging fully with the world. We're very limited in our responses because our brain is constantly telling us we're in danger and sending us to run away, fight something, or play dead. And so that can be really difficult in a social context. It really makes it difficult to connect with others because we're living in constant fear. And again, this is an unconscious process. It's not something that we're consciously choosing every day. It has been ingrained. And the more severe the violence or trauma, the more likely this is to happen. It does not happen for everybody. However, that lack of connection can then also impact the mental health piece even more. And then just decreased life satisfaction overall. Most survivors of IPV continue to live with not only the mental health outcomes and dealing with the trauma aspect, but it's hard for them to kind of remove themselves from the beliefs that are gained through IPV about themselves, about relationships, about others. And that can be really difficult it can take a toll on the life satisfaction of somebody. So those are just some of the outcomes. There's many more. Again, IPV is so nuanced that this is just like run of the mill, like your first steps. But every time I have a client that comes in with intimate partner violence, the situation is different, the outcomes are different. So just take this as like a general overview and know that there are nuances here. It's really important to understand the cycle that violence takes. So a lot of times it's not, especially at the start of violence. Let's say, you've been married for a few years, things have been great, and then all of a sudden a violent episode happens and either you or your partner is violent towards the other. This cycle comes into play, this cycle of violence. So we start and we have the violence that happens. This is when, we're being abused or we're experiencing abuse in our relationship. But then we move into this honeymoon phase. And this is when it's like, oh my gosh, we've come to our senses, kind of, and we apologize and we say sorry and we try and make up and, kind of smooth over the fact that the violence happened. So sometimes this honeymoon is kind of a fake honeymoon. It's like we deny it happened. We make excuses for why it happened. We either really apologize or kind of apologize, where it's kind of like a backhanded apology. But it's to smooth over the fact that the violence happened. And a lot of times what it does is it kind of like shoves it in the corner and says like, we're good. It's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. It's fine. But then we get into this place where we feel tension and we feel like we have to walk on eggshells because we know violence is possible, but we are not sure why, and we're not sure when it's going to happen. And so we start walking on eggshells. In severe situations, this is when like the abusive partner makes threats. This is when they start guilting the victim partner. This is when they start kind of using that power that we talked about earlier to put their partner down. And the partner then has to kind of decide how we're managing this. Like, how are we gonna not only walk on eggshells, but it's like, okay, what is gonna set them off? What is gonna keep them calm? And their whole life kind of becomes dictated around what can I and can I not do so that violence does not happen. But inevitably, violence will happen again. And then we repeat the whole cycle all over, and it keeps going. Now, if it's bidirectionally, which is, again, the most common, if both men and women are perpetrating, this cycle is even a little bit more intense because now we're both doing it. We're both engaging in violence. We're both kind of trying to sweep it under the rug or apologize, make it better. And then we're both walking on eggshells, which when we're both feeling that tense, it's inevitably going to lead to violence because we are not aware of ourselves. We are not really aware of our partner and what's going on for them. And so we get caught in this cycle of pushing each other, and then we inevitably engage in violence. So this is the common cycle of violence. Very common, very real. Now, it does look a little bit different depending on the type of violence that we're talking about. So that's not right. So when it comes to types of violence, there's a couple of different theories out there. The most common one, or the most recent, which kind of encapsulates all of them in a way, is that most violence fits into two categories. We have violence that is situational couple violence. This is also known as common couple violence. This is when both partners are violent towards each other. So this is that situation where, Sally Sally comes home and the house is a mess and she's frustrated. And then Jim comes home and he's mad that the house isn't clean. And so he starts picking on Sally. And then Sally starts picking on Jim because he's not helping. And then Jim gets fed up thinking that she's just not doing nothing at home. And then they start fighting. And before you know it, their emotions are up here. Their anger, their frustration is up here. And then whoever it is, honestly, typically a lot of times women initiate the violence, believe it or not, when it's in this situation. So let's say Sally pushes him, and then that pushes him over the edge, and now he slaps her, and now they're going at it. They're both at fault here. They're both engaging in violence. And really what the key factor for this common couple violence is it's about lack of regulation. It's about lack of good conflict tactics. It's about lack of respect for the partner, yes, but how they engage when their emotions are high and when they are frustrated or angry or dealing with an intense internal process. That is the key factor of common couple violence. It's this lack of regulation piece, this lack of ability to calmly or effectively deal with conflict and difficult emotions. Very rarely is it about one person trying to dominate the other. It's more about, I can't handle this anymore and now I'm lashing out. This is the most common type of violence. The other type of violence is called coercive control violence. It's also known as intimate terrorism, and this is much more severe in a lot of ways. So common couple violence happens less, it's more common, but for each couple individually, it's less common. Like it doesn't happen very often. If you were to like take a big group of people, you'll find this type of violence much more often than you will coercive controlling violence, but it doesn't happen as frequently for each couple. So let's just say this is the first time that Jim and Sally got into it. They're much more likely to kind of be like, oh, like we lost it. Like, let's make amends. Let's figure this out. And they might go another 6 months, year, 2 years, 5 years without a physical altercation. The frequency that this happens at is a lot lower in terms of the violence itself. But when it comes to intimate terrorism, this is much more of a power dynamic between partners. This is much more of I'm going to dominate and control you, and I'm going to use violent tactics to do that. So with these types of relationships, the violence is typically perpetrated by one partner. There's a lot of control involved. So this is the type of violence where the victim is very isolated socially, and that's part of the violent tactics. The abusive partner tends to cut off the survivor from friends, family, social groups, and any type of interaction that they are allowed to have is closely monitored. And very controlled, very controlled. There's rules, there's limits on what is allowed, what is not. A lot of times these survivors are tracked. Their whereabouts are monitored. They are only allowed to go to certain places. They're only allowed a certain amount of money each week. And typically it's like for food for the kids. Like they're not allowed access to finances. Their phones can be monitored. Their, electronic usage, their emails, things like that. So very, very controlling. And then you add on top of it the fact that there's physical violence happening as a tactic as well. But the difference between the physical violence and intimate terrorism and common couple violence is that the intimate terrorism violence is designed to create fear and control the partner. So threats, actually harming the victim, that's all about making them do something that the abuser wants them to do. So it's very, very severe. And a lot of times it's not seen. Most people don't know, until people come to me in clinic and talk to me about this, nobody knows what's going on for them. Nobody can see it. Nobody can tell. And it stays very quiet, but in the process, somebody's being very harmed. So it's a very sinister type of violence. This happens a lot less than situational couple violence, but it's a lot more severe. So knowing that, just being aware that, like, more often than not, if you yourself are experiencing it, if you have a friend that you think is experiencing it, it's likely common couple violence. But there is a possibility that it's intimate terrorism, but those are going to be a lot harder to spot. Sometimes you also have to consider, like, the type of person that the abuser is. So there's another theory that talks about how some violent partners are really only violent in the family. And it kind of fits along with situational couple violence. The frequency of violence is low. The severity is a lot less likely to, like, it's a lot less likely to be severe. But then you have people that are violent in conjunction with mental health and personality issues. And this is really about emotion regulation for them. Like, they don't have the skills to interact well with others, especially under duress. And then you have the people who are just violent in general. Like, they're violent with their partner and their families, and they're violent with other people. These are kind of like antisocial people who just use violence as a tactic wherever they are. So that's important to consider when you're kind of thinking about, okay, if I am experiencing this in my relationship, or if Jenny down the street is experiencing this, where is this fitting? What kind of violence are we actually dealing with? Is it just one person? Is it both of them? Is it, how are they feeding each other if it's both of them? What are the patterns at play here? And is the person who's violent, is it they're just violent at home? Or are they violent generally? Because that can really help lead to some big decisions that might need to be made. So let's talk about when violence happens. We've kind of gone over the whole violence spiel, what it is, what intimate partner violence is, what it typically looks like. When it happens, the first and foremost thing is safety. Whether you are the one being physically harmed or you are the person physically harming, the first thing you have to consider is safety. Is what you are doing. If you are the one hurting, are you creating safety at home? If not, maybe we need to reevaluate. If you're the one that is being harmed, considering, okay, do you have a safety plan? And by safety plan, I mean, who can you call or where can you go if you need to leave for a little bit? Who can you connect with to support you and maybe even allow you to come stay with them for the night? Now, when I say leave, I don't mean leave the relationship for good, but sometimes safety means you get out of the house and you and your partner are apart for that night. And can you do that safely without being victimized further? If not, if you cannot leave, because there are times when leaving actually decreases safety, it makes violence even worse. So if you cannot leave because that's what's going to happen, what can be done to de-escalate right now? De-escalate tension and anger, because that's the goal at this point. If violence is actually happening, the goal is either safety. Well, it's not either. The goal is safety. And if you cannot actually leave for safety, how do we de-escalate? And then we'll deal with the patterns and the happenings later. But right now, the main priority is safety, safety, safety. And if you cannot actually leave for safety, how can you de-escalate to create safety? If we're in this situation where we're both tempted to be physically violent, start gauging whether you are acting in self-defense or if you are retaliating. Self-defense in and of itself is sometimes considered partner violence, but when you're being attacked and you feel that self-defense is the most appropriate thing to keep you from being severely harmed, that's something to consider. But you really have to be honest with yourself too, because I don't know about you guys, but I know when somebody does something to me, whether it's like physical or just pushes my buttons, it's really hard for me to be like, okay, just take a deep breath, let it go. Like, this is not necessary. I don't need to engage right now. And so, especially when it comes to physical violence, do you need to defend yourself, or is you hitting back, is that retaliation? Because they're not the same. And retaliation, all it's going to do is escalate the situation further, and it's not going to help you create safety. Now, if self-defense is needed because you could be severely harmed if you don't engage, that is the higher priority. That's going to give you more safety. So again, we're gauging what is going to create more safety. Retaliation, probably not. Self-defense, if it's needed. The other thing too to consider is children in the home. When we have kids in the home with violent parents, it does have an impact on them. Even if we don't think they see it, even if we don't think they know, I'm here to tell you, kids know. They are smart little boogers, and they pick up on things that we think we keep so well hidden. I've had multiple kids come in and tell me like, oh yeah, like I hear mommy and daddy yelling all the time. And I'll bring in the parent a little bit later and talk to them individually, like, yeah, but they don't know we fight. I'm like, well, you know, they do, they hear you. So kids know, they really do know. Now, if violence is happening, it's better to have them out of sight than to have them directly witness it. Especially because when they're directly in contact with the violence between parents, they are now in the line of fire. And a couple of things happen. Depending on the age of kids you have, well, not even. Sometimes kids see that happening and they feel the need to get involved. So I've had multiple teenage clients come in and say like, I went in and I pushed my dad so he wouldn't hit my mom. So when they're in the room with you, they can feel the urge to get involved, and that puts them at higher risk of getting hurt themselves. And we don't want that. You know, it would be better that they hear it rather than get involved with it. But, you know, we can't always control that. And at that point, we just need to move to damage control. But really trying to make sure that your kids are not involved in these situations. It's also just, there's a lot of complicated issues when kids see violence between parents. So we try and avoid that as much as possible. We don't want them involved. We don't want them feeling like they're to blame. We don't want them possibly being at risk. Sometimes kids don't even get involved, but then they end up in the line of fire between their parents, and then they end up getting harmed. And so we want to avoid that too. If they did witness the violence directly, not just, you know, hearing it from their bedroom, which again, hearing from your bedroom has its own impact. That's not nothing. But if they did witness it, it would be important to discuss with them, depending on what the situation is. If this is where you're both being violent together, lack of emotion regulation, lack of conflict tactic skills, having conversation with the kids, letting them know, yeah, we messed up and we're going to fix it. This isn't your fault. We want you to be safe. If we're in a situation where one partner is very controlling, that gets really complex really quickly. And I don't want to get too much into it because each situation is very different, and what safety looks like for each situation is very different. But the best thing to do is to protect your child, is to let them know, like, you are working on a plan, that we need to just stay quiet for now, that we need to just keep living life for now while you as the adult work out a plan. And I would say, no matter the situation, if your kids have seen it, if they've been privy to it, especially for a long period of time, get professional help. Start seeing a therapist. I think seeing a therapist in these situations would be good anyways to help with the couple relationship. But if kids have witnessed it, yes, start up with a therapist. Make sure that they're able to process with you, and try and mitigate any impact that could happen from that. Let's see. So all of that is for when violence happens. Like, we didn't have our plan in place quite yet, so now we're gonna Now we have to deal with the violence still. But there are things to do to help keep the violence from your life. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about is for common couple violence. Again, with intimate terrorism or the coercive controlling violence, the story is a little bit different and it's a lot more complex because safety is harder to get and harder to find and much more complicated in arranging. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's start with this common couple violence piece. So first thing to know is that, or to remember, is that you and your partner or your spouse are in a dance when you're in conflict. You start moving with each other in certain ways. And when I say moving, I mean metaphorically. You know, one partner may bring a complaint to the table, and then the next time, and then, you know, the other partner becomes very defensive. And then the defensiveness sets partner number one on edge, and their frustration starts increasing because they don't feel heard and like their complaint mattered. And so now they start picking at partner number two. They start kind of hitting some sore spots that they know are areas of maybe self-consciousness for that partner. And so that partner number two feels pricked, feels attacked, feels like they're being picked on, and their anger starts to rise and they attack back. So now we're in this cycle or this dance of who can beat who. Like literally, who is gonna win out and do more harm to get the other to back down and shut up, basically. And a lot of times when we get in this dance, we are so oblivious to it because the emotions are just so intense, where our feelings are hurt a lot of the time. Anger is present, and we just don't even recognize it. And so we're lost in the dance without recognizing we're in the dance. And the first thing to do is recognize we are in a dance. We are in a cyclical pattern. And if we are gonna keep violence from happening, we have to stop this. We have to stop this dance and find a new pattern, find a new dance in the way that we engage, especially around difficult topics. So awareness is number one. Awareness that you and your partner are engaging in a pattern that's kind of like a dance, and you got to figure out the right steps, or else it's going to lead to violence. The next thing to do is become and work really hard to be aware of your own reactions and where your point of no return is. So I'll kind of explain what that means. When we have greater awareness of our own internal process, we're going to have greater awareness of our part in that dance that we're in with our partner. So thinking about how we can identify what we are feeling in any given moment, identify what's important to us in any given moment, even though we might be feeling attacked, and or feelings hurt or justified in our behaviors. Those things are good to be aware of, because then we can voice that instead of nitpicking at our partner and poking and throwing words and kind of coming at them with an attack. Mindfulness is super helpful in this. I don't know if you guys have heard of mindfulness. I think I said this way back when. I'm kind of considering maybe doing a mindfulness to wrap this whole webinar series up. I haven't decided yet, but mindfulness is amazing. Mindfulness basically is the practice of being fully aware of the present moment without judgment and with acceptance. And it's actually really hard to do. You have to practice it. But it helps you get in touch with yourself. It helps you get in touch with your emotions. It helps you get in touch with your responses and the source of those responses. So when our feelings are hurt, it's good to recognize our feelings are hurt, but then it's even better to try and grasp why our feelings were hurt. So for example, when my husband and I, when we get in a fight, like, I have to be very aware of, okay, my feelings are hurt right now. Why are my feelings hurt? Oh, because he accused me or complained about something that I do that really is something I've been working on for a long time to not do. And now I feel like I failed. So it's deeper than just hurt feelings. And we gotta work at being aware of those processes for ourselves. Our partner has to do it too. We can't do it for them. You know, we can work to try and understand our partner and understand their cues that they give us and things like that. But really getting in touch with yourself and your emotions is your job. And as you do that, when you engage in the dance, you're going to be able to recognize, like, I'm getting defensive. Okay. Instead of allowing defensiveness to choose how I respond right now, how do I want to respond? And then you can change the whole dance by saying, hold on, I'm getting defensive. I don't want to be defensive. Let me get myself together, and then I will respond to you. That changes everything. And it keeps you from this escalation point and then getting to your point of no return. So a point of no return, I have this little graph here. So typically, when violence doesn't just happen out of the blue, especially when we're talking about common couple violence, there's typically a buildup. And so when we start with like this minor annoyance, like, oh, man, they're chewing really loudly again. Like, can't they keep their mouth closed when they chew? Like, this is so gross. Like, it's grating on me. And sometimes we stay there and we're able to deal with it, and it's fine. But then let's say something else gets tacked onto it. They didn't help me pick up the dishes after dinner. I do this every night. This is getting really old. I'm really upset. So now we're angry. And now when we're angry, what do? Do we let it go? Do we let it smolder? Or do we pick? What are we doing with the anger? But if we're doing things that cause our anger to increase even more and cause our partner's anger to increase even more, we start feeding off of each other. And then we hit our point of no return. And when I say point of no return, that means there's no de-escalating at that point. We are full force ahead. We are going. We literally do not have our heads on straight enough to be able to de-escalate. The anger has gotten so big and the frustration has gotten so powerful that we can no longer connect with that inner self that we've been working so hard to become aware of. It's gone. It literally is like our brains are in a fog. And so we cannot bring ourselves down at that point. And that will inevitably lead to the violence if you have violence in your relationship. And so being aware that you have a point of no return, and it is your job to understand where that point is. Is it when you've asked for the 10th time for help on something? Is it when your partner does a certain thing or says a certain thing to you in a certain way? Like, where is your point of no return? Because you have to understand that, and you have to communicate that to your partner. So something that, like, my husband and I do to each other is like, I'm up here. Like, I need you to stop. I'm up here. And we take a minute and we cool it down, because if we go past up here, if we go past that, there's no return. And then we are in a full-blown fight. And so considering where your point of no return is going to be really important in helping change that dance that you get in with your partner. It also helps you know when to take the next step, which is take a time out. Take a time out when the conversation starts getting up to that point of no return. This is incredibly important. A lot of times couples feel like they have to stick it out until there's a resolution. But that is not a good tactic when you're dealing with trying to stop violence. A better tactic is to know those points of no return, being able to clearly communicate it and saying, let's take a minute and time out. When I say a minute, I don't literally mean a minute. It actually takes about, research has shown that for men, it takes about 45 minutes to an hour to cool off completely. And for women, it's between half an hour and 45 minutes. So when you take a time out, take at least 45 minutes. Like, don't say, like, we're going to revisit this in 10 minutes. Like, take time. And go in separate rooms, go in separate directions. Do not interact during this timeout. Just take a minute, 45 minutes at least. Take 45 minutes and bring yourself down. so that you're not so close to that point of no return. Now, when you do this, you have to engage in this with the understanding, both of you have to understand, like, that doesn't mean the conversation is over. Part of timeout is we also agree that we're going to come back and talk about this. And you set that time. So, okay, you know what? I'm at my point, like I can't talk about this anymore, else it's not going to go well. I need 45 minutes. I'm going to go do the dishes. Please don't bother me. I'll come find you in 45 minutes to an hour and we can finish our conversation. But right now I can't do this. So having that expectation laid out for both partners, like, okay, we're going to take this amount of time. I'm going to go here. You're going to go there. We're going to cool off. And then we will come back together and finish this conversation. This does wonders for so many different reasons. Again, when we're up here, we do not think clearly. Emotion starts taking over, and then we start saying things and interacting in ways that are emotion-driven rather than connection-driven. And it's really difficult to have a connecting conversation, even if it's a tough conversation, a conflictual conversation. Connection is possible, but it's really hard to do that if we are up here with emotion. So taking the time out with the set parameters is going to be really important, because then you give yourself time to reconnect to your logical brain, get into this space where you can acknowledge emotion and also think through things clearly and not let emotion decide for you what you're going to do. And that gives you way more power to have a good conversation with your loved one. It gives you way more capacity. When we're over flooded with emotion, our capacity to problem solve, to come together, to connect, to figure out, a good, I don't like the word solution because arguments don't always have a solution, but to have a good connecting, even though difficult conversation, that capacity goes out the window when our emotions are flooding our brains. And so giving yourself this opportunity and giving your marriage or your relationship the opportunity to have something that's good and connecting, rather than we have to talk about this now, but it's really difficult because we're both so emotional and we can't keep it together. Like, that's not going to get you anywhere. It's better to take a minute, 45 minutes, better to take 45 minutes, cool off, and then come back together and finish the conversation. Also, recognize that you can follow that pattern as much as you need to. Let's say you take a 45-minute break, you're feeling pretty good. Your spouse is feeling pretty good too. You come back together, and within 10 minutes, you guys are back up here. Take another 45-minute break. The alternative, like, that's so much better than the alternative of getting back into the same old dance and pattern of leading to violence. Like, you're doing something beneficial, and it will get easier the more you do it. The more that you work on being aware of yourself and your own internal process, your own emotions, your own reactions, and being able to state those. And then the more you practice, acknowledging those and acknowledging when they're in control and you need a break, the easier this is going to be. And then the less you will need the timeouts, because you'll be able to call it out right as it's happening. And then you guys can make some shifts so that the conversation doesn't escalate even more. Then you can stay in it. So this is a temporary process. This is a training process to help you and your spouse be able to engage in these difficult conversations, gain the skills that you need with that, so that you don't escalate to violence or extreme frustration or anger. Kind of along the same lines, like I kind of said this, like, have designated spaces and times for cooling off. Like, don't be in the same room as each other when you're trying to cool off. It's the temptation to just keep picking and picking and picking is too high. So don't do that. Give yourselves like the best shot possible of success, and giving each other, 45 minutes without interruption to cool off and really gain control again. Something I have my clients do when they're in therapy with me is to commit to no violence in a relationship. And it's an individual commitment as well as a relational commitment. That means committing to this process, committing to being aware of yourself and your reactions, and committing to a timeout when you need it, and committing to focusing on what you really want in your relationship. Again, like I said earlier, most couples that have violence in their relationship don't want the relationship to end. They don't want to get out. They don't want it to, you know, blow up in smoke. They just are really struggling with connection and connecting with their partner and trusting their partner. And so the more you commit and the more effort you put into this and changing these patterns, the more you're going to see trust increase in your partner. The more you're going to see, you know, the positive sides in your relationship. The more you're going to see the good qualities of your partner rather than just the ones that set you off. So being able to recognize that, having a commitment, it does something for some people. It kind of flips this switch in their brain, and then they become fully committed to this process, and then it gets a lot easier as they practice. And like I said earlier with the child piece, you got to know when it's time to get help. A lot of times people try, and again, for whatever reason, for embarrassment, shame, acknowledgement that, you know, violence is not typically looked well upon in a marriage or in a romantic relationship. Sometimes people hesitate to come into therapy and get help, but it's probably the best thing you could do, because then you have this neutral third-party person helping you with this process and changing these patterns so that you don't escalate up to violence, and that you can kind of take a step back and see things from a different perspective. It's a big step, and I think this for most anything when you're seeking therapy, like, it can be hard to go to that first session. It can be hard to feel comfortable enough to do it, but in my experience, like, it's always been worth it. I'm a therapist by my training, but I've also been a client in therapy, and it has been, even I'm a therapist. I like do this all the time. But even when I'm a client, I have a hard time getting in the door for that first session. There's something about it. I don't know if it's just stigma or judgment or embarrassment or what. It's probably a plethora of things. But if you can do it, if you can stick it out, the results that you're going to gain are going to be so much better than if you tried to just do this on your own for the most part. So this is all for the common couple violence. Now, if the violence is very severe and or controlling. The most I want to say about this, because like I said, these situations are so complicated and so complex, and safety is always the first priority, but how you go about getting safety is so different for each situation. The biggest thing I would say is know your resources. Know the women's shelters in your area. Know the programs, they call them battered women programs. But like, know the programs available to you, know what services you can access, and you know which ones are going to be easy for you to access under monitoring or tracking. That's going to be your best bet. And then again, seek professional help. Work really hard with somebody who can guide you through the process of deciding what you want to do with your relationship, and then helping you make that happen. You need an advocate in these situations. It's very hard to deal with really severe violence or controlling violence on your own, particularly because, like I said earlier, isolation is a big piece of this type of violence. And so recognizing that the more people you can have in your corner, the more successful this is going to be for you, the better it's going to the better outcomes are going to have for you. So those are my two big pieces of advice that I feel like kind of cover the board generally. Again, because these situations are so severe and so complicated, you know, how we go about creating safety is different for each one. So know your resources and seek professional help. The family therapy clinic at Texas Tech University actually has a whole intimate partner violence protocol. It's one of the things that they are most proficient in. And so they would be a good place to start, and they could probably refer you to other people as well if you, for some reason, can't see them. And then there is the Women's Protective Services of Lubbock. They have resources. They have their, you know, the shelter system here in Lubbock, and they are very protective of their clients. I know that for a fact. I've worked with them a couple of times, and are very, very protective of their women. In terms of resources for men, unfortunately, they're very slim. And that's why I say it's really good to know your resources. And I would start with a professional, like a therapist or a counselor, to kind of get your foot in the door and find access to more resources for men. It is trickier to find. Unfortunately, it's a gap in our field. And mostly because, like I said earlier, women are physically more vulnerable, but men are survivors too in a lot of cases. And unfortunately, we just have not caught up with that fact. So start with a professional, start with a therapist, start with somebody that can guide you to those appropriate resources. So please let me know. I think I saw a question in the chat earlier. Let me pull it up. Let me stop this real quick. How am I doing this? I'm on 2 monitors, so it gets a little crazy. There we go. Okay. So yes, and I apologize, I didn't read this earlier. Most of it is IPV related tonight, but there will be a presentation on couples in June, on June, oh, what day was it? There's a new schedule up. Let me look it up real quick. I believe it's June 17th. Yes. So June 17th, we'll talk more about couple relationships and and connection and stuff like that. So are there any other questions or concerns or thoughts? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming this evening. Next week, we will be talking about teenagers and their mental health, defiant and struggling teenagers. Dr. Sydney Schleiden, she is a marriage and family therapist in the Dallas area. She works specifically with adolescents and specifically with adolescents in the juvenile justice system out there. So she has a lot of experience working with teenagers, and she'll be great. She's going to be speaking to us about how we can help our youth and with their mental health and their own struggles. So thank you so much for coming tonight, and we will see you all next week at 6 o'clock.